concerns or things you're wondering. So why don't we start with just any questions or reactions from the book? Just think, I know anti-Semitism is such a big topic, and there's just so many different avenues we can go down. I prepared some thoughts today or some analysis to share, but why don't we start with any questions?
I don't have questions, but I have compliments.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you really did your research.
Oh, thank you.
And I mean, you know, we all think we know so much about it, but I learned a lot from reading your book. And you know what? I don't want to bring up the last chapter now if nobody wants, because I don't know that people got there. But when you talk about national service and serving in the military, I don't know how many people on this call have had a similar experience to mine. But right after we got married, my husband had a commission and went into the Air Force as an officer. And we were stationed in England, about 65 miles north of London. And I have to tell you, from what I read in your book, you have it so right. So right. Because it really opened up our eyes and opened up our life to so many, to people from all over the country, people with different backgrounds, different religions, and some of them had never met Jews until they met us, and befriended us in very warm ways. And we, them, I mean, I even had a Black obstetrician, if you can imagine. And in England. Well, he was in the Air Force. He was an Air Force doctor. And he was the nicest person and a wonderful wife and 3 gorgeous children. And I mean, you just never thought about it. They were, and they respected us as well. And it just opened up it changed our lives. It really did.
Beautiful.
We came back here and all our old friends were exactly the same as they'd always been, but we were different. Right.
You went through that experience. That's beautiful. Yeah, there is something very powerful about kind of a national service, or where people of all different backgrounds come together. And that doesn't happen much in America anymore. Even college isn't like that. I mean, you know, you go to college and you mostly, I mean, yes, there's diversity, but people stick in their own subgroups. And you really don't, unless you really seek it out. I mean, you know, if somebody really seeks it out in college, you can get it, but most people, you know, you just do what you got to do. Whereas something like the Army and national service, it's part of it. You're in, and that's what you do.
I've always been in favor of the draft, and a lot of my friends thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
I said, there should be a draft.
Right.
And all these politicians' children should have to go.
Yeah, that's true too. Right. You see the impact of what you vote for. That's great.
I think the politicians ought to have to go. Forget the kids.
Yeah. Well, that is something
very similar experience as Susan had. Only I wasn't an officer. I was a private. I got drafted, and here I am in Fort Hood, Texas, in a barracks I never dreamt about in my life. I'm so naive, you have no idea how naive I was at the time. And I got into a fight with a guy about being Jewish, and it wound up that they left me alone after that. But that's the way it is. And I made a couple of good friends while I was in the Army, including one Latino, Garcia. And he was from LA and I'm from Chicago. Was a whole entirely different world.
Wow. That's great. What a positive experience. Other thoughts, reactions. So what I wanted to talk about today, a couple of things that I read over the past week that kind of echoed some interesting. So I'm reading this wonderful book by the same author who wrote Hamilton, you know, the biography that became the basis for the musical.
Chernow.
Yeah, Chernow. He wrote a book about 10, 15 years ago about the Warburgs, who were a Jewish banking family, similar to the Rothschilds, not as big as the Rothschilds, but went from Germany to the United States. And it's a fascinating book, just so beautifully written too. But one of the things that sparked that kind of jumps out of it is the anti-Semitism. And then at the same time, I was reading an article from the Daily Beast about George Soros and how George Soros is this kind of anti-Semitic symbol today. This article was called, "There's been a George Soros for every era of anti-Semitic panic." And I think that nails it. That absolutely nails kind of what we're going through right now. So I want to just trace a little bit of this history. So this is a particular type of anti-Semitism. And this is the anti-Semitism of seeing Jews as a manipulative, evil, totally unsympathetic, pulling the wheels of history without any regard for humanity. And this actually has some roots in kind of a traditional Christian, one of the old anti-Semitic canards, lies, is that the Old Testament is the God of vengeance and of law, and the New Testament is the God of love and of mercy. And so this idea is really kind of embedded in Christianity. You even see it sometimes in phrase like Old Testament vengeance. You probably heard that. That's playing on a stereotype. That phrase, Old Testament vengeance, the Old Testament God. It plays on this idea of a merciless God. And then this idea applied to Jews are merciless Jews, people who care only about themselves. And this line of anti-Semitic thinking really emerges in Western Europe, kind of at the beginning of the modern era. So from a historical point of view, the 1700s, 1800s, this is the era of the rise of the nation state, the declining power of the church and the rise of states, Germany, France, Britain uniting, and, the kind of Italy, and there came this image of the Jewish banker, the court Jew, who lent money to, and this is true, this part is true, that there was court Jews who served as essentially bankers to nation states, emerging nation states. And that's how essentially the Rothschilds and the Warburgs got started. This was they lent money to different princes in Germany. Germany was different little kind of mini states, each of whom had a ruler, and there was money lent to fight wars, essentially. But over time, this twisted kind of anti-Semitic lie came up, and it really centered first around Nathan Rothschild. So Nathan Rothschild is the George Soros of 200 years ago. Nathan Rothschild was the son of Mayer Rothschild, who was sort of the founder of the dynasty. And this anti-Semitic first kind of charge was that during the Battle of Waterloo, the famous Battle of Waterloo, that Nathan Rothschild had spies on both sides, and he knew the result of the war before anyone else did. Therefore, he got money back to London, and he started a rumor that Britain had lost the war. He started a rumor, and so the price of British bonds went way down. Then he bought up all the bonds, and then when news actually came that actually we won the Battle of Waterloo, the price of the bonds skyrocketed, and he made a fortune. And this anti-Semitic lie was published in a pamphlet in the middle of 5 years after he died. So he had no chance to rebut it. This came much later, and it stuck in the British memory that this Jewish banker had profited by tricking everybody and using he didn't really have a side. He was on both sides. When he found out that the British won, he immediately manipulated that knowledge to make money. And that lie really kind of spread this anti-Semitic view of the Rothschilds, which still exists. I mean, you actually, that is, if you just Google Rothschild family, you'll find all kinds of conspiracies on the internet. I mean, it's still there. Lots of it's still there. And so this was the George Soros of his era, Nathan Rothschild. Then fast forward 50, 100 years, you get Max Warburg. So actually, that people say Max Warburg may have been the model for Daddy Warbucks in the Annie musical. But Max Warburg was the son or the grandson of the founder of the Warburg banking dynasty. And he was close with the Kaiser of Germany. He helped loan money to the Kaiser. Well, when things got bad and there were failed revolts in Germany, who was blamed? Who was said to be pulling the strings behind the scenes? But Max Warburg. And that's those same kind of charges, the same kind of lies about not really having a side. You know, and there's this famous quotation that is applied to Mayer Rothschild, which he probably never said, but he said, "I don't really care who the kings or politicians are, so long as I can control the money supply, I'm happy." Which is, of course, is essentially saying that Jews are behind the scenes, controlling the money supply, and don't really care which side wins or loses, so long as they win and get rich off of it. So this kind of logic is applied first to Nathan Rothschild, then Max Warburg, and then it's applied here and there throughout history, but then really comes back to a roar in the last 10 years around George Soros. So George Soros is a very interesting kind of figure. He's become a lightning rod for anti-Semitism, a huge lightning rod. And his history is quite interesting. So he was born in Hungary to a Jewish family, and he survived the Holocaust by pretending to be Christian. So he could essentially pass until he was able to escape. And then he escaped, I think first to London, then to the United States, ultimately succeeded, started one of the first hedge funds ever done, and made a fortune. And one of the places where he made a lot of money actually became fodder for anti-Semitism. So he made a bet, I think it was in 1992, betting against the British pound, essentially saying Great Britain is going to have to devalue the pound because they have too much debt. And he made $1 billion in one day. And this is, back in the early 90s. So $1 billion is even more back then. So became very successful, and then has essentially given away huge amounts of money, mostly to pro-democracy causes. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, he created what's called the Open Democracy Institute, which tries to foster democratic cultures in former Eastern Europe and so forth, and also gave to a lot of other causes. By the way, he's Jewish, but is not at all involved in Jewish philanthropy, like 0 point. There's no giving to any Jewish organization, not American Jewish Committee, not Birthright, nothing. But he's Jewish and doesn't disavow his Judaism. He's certainly not, doesn't identify as anything else, but he's not an active member of the Jewish community. But he has become this huge target of anti-Semitism, primarily because he is associated with globalism. And so let me read you a part of this article. It's just so interesting. This says, Soros is named as the architect and sponsor of almost every revolution and coup around the world for the last 25 years. This is an anti-Semitic post. Thanks to him and his puppets, United States of America is thought to be a vampire, not a lighthouse of freedom and democracy. The oligarch who sired the US vampire and whose slaves spill blood of millions and millions of people just to make him even more rich. That's what they say about Soros. And it even got into the political realm. You know, when Brett Kavanaugh was nominated as Supreme Court Justice, there were protests, and somebody said, "Oh, all the protesters are being paid by Soros," there are commercials which says the United States are being robbed by a predatory elite, and when that, you know, their images. There was a famous political commercial in 2016 with images of Soros saying the United States is being destroyed by this predatory elite with a picture of Soros. He, you know, he's just constantly targeted, especially in Hungary, his native Hungary. So this article says, it's just quite interesting. Other Jewish boogeymen may haunt the fever dreams of the vicious, but the scale and intensity of attacks on Soros are unrivaled. They reveal what the global nationalist right believes is at stake at this present moment. We may one day look back on this era as the Soros age of anti-Semitism. And it's important to distinguish between intent and effect. Of course, a person who shares a conspiracy theory about George Soros may not intend to promulgate anti-Semitism. And of course, not every Soros conspiracy theory is anti-Semitic, but the image of the rich, powerful Jew who manipulates social and political movements around the world for his own agenda is an ancient anti-Semitic trope. Because Soros' identity is so well known, this is the ADL writing now, we are concerned that conspiracy theories about George Soros may have the effect of reinforcing this trope and spreading it throughout the broader population. This is especially true when other anti-Semitic tropes are woven in, such as the claims that Soros controls the media or the banks, or when he is described using terms that harken back to medieval claims that Jews are evil, demonic, or agents of the Antichrist. So what do you think? Where do you think this is coming from? Why all this conspiracy theory around one rich guy? What do you make of it? What explains this fascination with Soros? What in our culture is permitting that?
The social media.
Social media. So rumors can spread, lies and rumors can spread really quickly. Yes, that's a big part of it, right? You can certainly take a lie and it can, you know, before it could be fact checked, it can easily spread around the world. I would also say, you know, my grandfather used to say, you know, what did he say? He said, behind it, something about how every joke, there's a kernel of truth, or every time you make fun of somebody, there's a kernel of truth in it, something like that. I don't remember the exact quote, but there's actually, I mean, so Nathan Rothschild did profit after the Battle of Waterloo. He didn't have secret information that he used, but he did. And George Soros did profit when the pound devalued, which hurt a lot of British people. He did profit. So these are all facts. But then you take that fact and you twist it into an anti-Semitic lie, because plenty of other people profited from plenty of other things just like that. But when you focus on just the Jewish element of it, it becomes anti-Semitic. So part of the reason there is a kernel, I don't want to say a kernel of truth, but there is a slight fact. There are within the 100 lies, there are maybe 2 or 3 truths. So that gives just the little glimmer of truth, gives all the lies greater legitimacy. So that helps explain part of it. So social media lies spread quickly, glimmers slight, 2 or 3% truth to it. What else? What else explains this rise of this fascination? I bet 20 years ago, unless you were in the financial press, no one had ever heard of George Soros. And yet now, you hear him on the news all the time. What else explains it?
What else could?
What about fears of globalization? We live, anti-Semitism, and this is another thing just to remember, anti-Semitism thrives in unstable changing times. When things seem difficult, when there's not a clear path always, when change is rapid, people have a hard time adjusting to that change and look for familiar victims. And over the last 20 years, the world has become much more global, right? I mean, we're seeing that now with the supply chain backup, because semiconductors are mainly made in Taiwan, and it's hard to get a used car, because antibiotics were made in China for a while. We had supply chain issues in the United States. I mean, we live in this increasingly global world that introduces greater uncertainty. And Soros, banking has always been kind of global. And here's a guy who has an accent, a thick accent. He's born in Hungary, and he can typify he's a symbol of the fear. He's an easy target to explain why we're having hard times in this global world. Because here's this guy who's really manipulating he's the puppet master behind the scenes that's making our lives difficult. And he gives money in, when Soros donates, which he donates a huge amount, it's often through different organizations. So that gives credence to people who say, well, he's hiding the way he's giving. He's hiding his money so that people don't know it's him behind the scenes doing it. So he's this like a Svengali, but manipulating the world without drawing attention to himself, like a Wizard of Oz. So that adds to the anti-Semitic part of it. There's a kind of mystery to it. What else? How else do you explain this? I mean, it's really remarkable. Other comments about this? Why do you think that Jews are often associated with not just, I'm not trying to talk about Jews and money, because we sort of talked about that with banking, but with a sinister manipulation of money, that there's an indifference, where Jews are probably the most philanthropic people. And yet there's this idea that the use of money is sinister. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, it's the basis of a lot of anti-Semitism. Any ideas?
The 12 pieces of silver and Judas.
Okay, so you're saying it harkens back to the kind of
time of Christ.
Yeah, right. Okay, I think you're onto something there. So one of the metaphors that I've used to talk about anti-Semitism is it's a virus. And a virus adapts to its environment. And a virus will graft different ideas to create a new thing. So what happens with anti-Semitism is aspects of, anti-Semitism goes through different eras, right? You have the Christian anti-Semitism, which really, starts at the beginning of Christianity, but reaches its peak in the Middle Ages. Then you have racial anti-Semitism, which really starts in the 19th century and kind of peaks during the Holocaust. So there are different types of anti-Semitism. But what happens is certain parts are grafted together. So this idea of Jews being solely interested in profit with Judas gets placed into this idea that Jews are manipulating, this manipulative idea of anti-Semitism, which really that actually comes more from the 19th century. The idea that Jews are the power behind the throne, that goes back to a very famous book written in the 19th century called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of the classic anti-Semitic books written. It was written by someone who worked for the Tsar of Russia and was seeking a convenient victim, somebody to blame for all the unrest happening in the Soviet Union. And so this book starts off with a secret meeting of the Jewish elite, which is held every year at all places, at the Jewish cemetery in Prague. This is where the secret Jewish elite meet every year to determine the fate of the world. This is how this book starts off. By the way, I mean, not a bad setting. I mean, that Jewish cemetery in Prague is quite remarkable. I mean, it's a very it's kind of an eerie place. But the idea is that this small group is manipulating all the events of history. And then you graft in the idea that Jews are only in it for themselves, the two, which comes from early Christianity. So two comes together that Jews are manipulating the world solely for their own benefit. And that all the wars that are started, those wars are there to enrich Jews. And the revolutions that happen, the Bolshevik Revolution is there simply to enrich Jews. And all of, so you have this mixture of anti-Semitic ideas. And that, I mean, this is, by the way, very, very prominent around World War I as well. There's a book, I think it's called The Tragedy of It All or something like that. And it talks about how really that the World War I was foreshadowed by the Boer War in you know, you've heard about the Boer War in South Africa. And part of the reason for the Boer War was Cecil Rhodes controlled these diamond mines in South Africa. Of course, Cecil Rhodes is not Jewish, but there was a group, but he was funded by the Rothschilds. So the idea was that these Jewish bankers who had interests in British colonialism were really responsible for starting wars so that they could control more territory. And then add in that the Balfour Declaration comes out of World War I, and Jewish Zion, now you add the Zionist overlay to this manipulation of the world. And so these different strands of anti-Semitism come to form even deeper conspiracy theories. And this actually is quite, there is something about the American mind where we are very susceptible to conspiracy theories. It's very interesting. There's actually been a lot written about this. There's a very famous historian named Richard Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter wrote, was a historian, I think 50s and 60s, and he talked about the conspiratorial mind of Americans, that we fall prey to easy, simplistic explanations of things. And sometimes, you know, politicians of both sides use this. I mean, this is not exclusively one political party or the other, but it is often used for anti-Semitism. We, by the way, just saw an example of this. Somebody brought it up at our class last week, and I looked it up afterwards, with the lady in Arizona who went to a school board meeting, which was all about critical race theory in schools, and said it all goes back to the Jews, you know, which, I mean, you can think what you will about critical race theory, but it has nothing to do with Jews. I mean, and yet somebody, you know, some person says all the bad things that I don't like in the world are blamed on Jews. And Hofstadter said these kinds of explanations tend to appeal to certain subsets of the American population because for whatever reason, and he's not quite clear about explaining why this is, but we have an openness to conspiracy theories in America. It's very interesting. It's not as true in other cultures. You see some of it. I mean, there's other cultures that certainly have conspiracy theories, but we in America tend to have it a lot. Why do you think that is? Which, again, makes certain groups very ripe for anti-Semitism. What explains our American propensity for conspiracy theories?
There's so many different people in this country. They're all talking about different things. You don't know sometimes what's true, what's not true.
Okay, so simply the diversity. When there's so many different groups, a more simplistic explanation can kind of help simplify things, maybe. Okay, what else? Why are we Americans so susceptible to conspiracy theories? What do you think? It's a very interesting question. At least it is to me. Why do you think we're so susceptible to them? It might have to do with our anti-government kind of I don't know what I want to say, history, but ethos that the essentially, in some ways, the founding of America was essentially, in some ways, a conspiracy. These were the people who conspired together to revolt against the British. So there is, in some ways, how, I mean, we would probably say that's a positive conspiracy, but there is this kind of mindset that there are powers that are trying to oppress us, and they're manipulating others to hurt us. So therefore, we have to figure out where those powers are. And we're seeing it again. I mean, QAnon, we talked a little bit about that, I think, a couple of weeks ago. There's a whole section, I was researching this week, there's a whole section in QAnon about the Rothschilds too. So again, you have this old conspiracy theory about the Rothschilds brought in and applied to this new conspiracy theory about QAnon. So in the United States, again, this might also, the United States has always had a kind of aversion to centralization. Hamilton was vilified for many because he wanted a national bank of the United States, and people didn't want a national bank. And so the urban-rural divide in America has also been enormously, if you want to try to understand the kind of tensions in America, some of it's Republican, Democrat political views, but a lot of it is urban versus rural. Urban versus rural. And this is as long a part of America. I remember watching the series on prohibition that was on PBS. This was maybe 10, 15 years ago, and talked about how prohibition, much of it was rural backlash against urban Catholics. There was this feeling that urban Catholics drink too much and they're polluting our cities. And so we have to, to bring back this sort of pure American ethos, we need a prohibition. And that it was the urban groups that were leading to violence and saloons and undermining American culture. So you have this urban-rural divide. And generally that also translates to a big, small, big cities, small towns. And conspiracy theories are often about centralization of power. What central authority is pulling strings? So we're susceptible to that in some ways because America has this kind of suspicion of big things and urban areas. We're susceptible to these conspiracy theories. I mean, again, we're seeing it right now around elections, around QAnon, and I think that makes people even more ripe for anti-Semitism. Does that make sense? Is this line of thinking, does it resonate with you? What do you think? Anybody? Anyone want to counter it? Anyone think it's wrong? Someone's got to have an opinion about conspiracy theories. Why are we so susceptible to them? I'm interested in knowing what you think. Yeah.
Well, we're used to conspiracy theories. No matter what event that's national, there's a counter information to what actually happened. And
Okay,
that's
good.
a conspiracy theory.
Okay, good.
You
good.
look at the Kennedy assassination, there's more than one conspiracy theory. Who knows how many there are?
Good, excellent. And that's an excellent example. There's how this one event has sparked so much drama in American life, and lots of conspiracy theories, which people are still exploring. Very good. Sue?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of hit it on the nail on the head when you said because so many people are anti-government. So anything the government says is ripe for questioning. And when you start questioning, you start looking for things that aren't really there. And I think there's just a huge a number in this population that are doing that right now.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. That's a really good point, that it's just growing. Yeah. And that's a difference. That is a big difference between America and other countries. I was listening to a podcast recently, and we talked about it was talking about Israel. And essentially what it said about Israel is that Israelis have huge trust in their government, much, much more than we do. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that. Partly it's Zionism was built, it's a relatively recent state, it's only 70 some years old. Also national service, the military. So when Israel, people have differing political views, of course, but there was no vaccine hesitation in Israel. When Israel mandated vaccines and vaccine cards and essentially vaccine passports, there was virtually no, I'm sure there's a little bit, not every people, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, you're going to have some opposition, but the trust in government is much, much greater in Israel and almost in most other countries than it is in the United States. So that lends itself to more conspiracy theories, especially if government is becoming more powerful. Good. Other questions?
In terms of QAnon and conspiracy theories, I remember being quite astounded to find out that Stephen Miller was Jewish.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah. He's. You bring up a very interesting point. By the way, this is happening right now. A guy who's running for president of France, I don't know if the election has happened yet, but he's like National Front, which was an anti-Semitic party, and he's Jewish. Mm-hmm. And he's the nominee for the National Front Party, or he's or another party that has virtually the same ideas. And Bernard Henry Levy, who's a very prominent Jewish intellectual in France, has come out and said this Jewish candidate is anti-Semitic. So it's like, well, does that make sense? So
no, it doesn't.
It doesn't. I mean, certain positions that he takes, one could say, lend themselves to anti-Semitism. I mean, it's kind of like one could say about Trump. You'd be hard pressed to argue. Maybe some people might disagree with me on this, which is fine. I don't think Donald Trump personally is anti-Semitic. I mean, I think he probably loves his daughter and loves his grandchildren. I mean, but certain rhetoric and decisions lend themselves to anti-Semitism. So one could say about someone like Stephen Miller, well, he's Jewish, so it's doubtful that he doesn't like Jews, but there are things that he does or says that give credence and legitimacy to anti-Semitism. So it's very hard. It's kind of like, the African-American community has the same issues, right? I just was reading about this. The woman who was elected lieutenant governor, I think, of Virginia, is a Republican African-American woman. And there are people who are saying, well, Virginia election was a reflection of Southern racism. Well, how do you say then that she's the first, lieutenant governor who's African-American and she was just elected? How do you say that's racist? And they said, well, she's saying the words that lend credence to racist arguments. Well, so it's hard to separate. All identity, what we understand as identity, is socially constructed. So what do I mean by that? Unless you believe in a biological definition of Judaism and say simply someone is Jewish who is born to a Jewish mother or converts to Judaism. Now, some people do subscribe to that definition, but we would probably say Judaism is much bigger than that. It's a set of ideas. It's a religion. It involves different practices and so forth. So any kind of identity is not, it's not pure. Nothing, it's not 100% pure. It involves multiple sources. So there is no, what one defines as being Jewish and Judaism is varied. So what may seem anti-Semitic to one person may not be anti-Semitic to another. So it's kind of hard to come down with definitions. Same with racism. What's racist to one person may not be racist to another. And this is actually this is a very important issue in understanding contemporary anti-Semitism, because someone like Stephen Miller, someone would say Stephen Miller is anti-Semitic. Someone could, I'm sure that argument has been made, but then he said, well, he's Jewish. And someone could say, well, the fact that you are saying Stephen Miller is anti-Semitic means that you are anti-Semitic. You know, I mean, this could be twisted and used in so many different ways precisely because it is so complicated. Does that make sense? This is hard to unpack. Modern anti-Semitism is very complex. Yeah, Sue?
Well, you know, it means that people can't be multidimensional. I mean, you know,
that's a good point. It's a good point.
People have more than one trait.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That actually goes a little bit back to Soros. You know, Soros is probably not a very nice man. I mean, a guy who makes $1 billion shorting of the British pound, which hurts a lot of people. You know, when money loses 20% of its value, a lot of people get poorer and suffer. And he actually was interviewed about this, and he said, well, what I do in my business, it's not moral, it's amoral. I'm there to make money, you know. Now, but that same guy then gives money away. So he's a complicated individual. He's multidimensional. On one sense, he is operating in an immoral sphere. Not immoral, amoral. That it's not about right or wrong.
Moral.
It's kind of like somebody who's an attorney and maybe they're representing tobacco companies. And you could say, well, you know, that's awful. And that person could say, look, I'm an attorney. My job is to defend my client. And my client is this tobacco company. And that's what I do. And then I can give money that I make from it to anti-smoking groups or to, cancer research. But I'm dividing, I am a complex person. I am dividing parts of my life. Now, one could legitimately criticize that and say, well, sorry, you can't do that. And that's fair. But one could make the opposite argument and say, look, I believe everyone deserves representation. What they're doing is legal. Maybe it's not moral, but it's legal. And I want to defend the legality of it. You know, so people are complex. And I think what you're saying is anti-Semitism oversimplifies things. If we just, unless we look at the bigger picture. What else? How can a Jew? So let me ask you this question. Can a Jewish person be anti-Semitic?
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible? How is that possible? I think it is too, by the way, on both sides. I think you can be a left-wing anti-Semite too. Now this really isn't anti-Semitism, but did anyone read that article in the New York Times about the rabbinical students who signed this letter, essentially extremely critical of Israel? Essentially saying, didn't say Israel's guilty of genocide, and didn't use the word apartheid, but came pretty close to it. And the New York Times had a fascinating story about this. In some sense, it's a generational divide, but it's even more than that. It's a divide amongst rabbinical students. And on the Rabbi's Facebook page, there was all kinds of debate about it. Now that debate has since been superseded by, this really sad. There was a new report just came out about Hebrew Union College and about all the sexual offenders that were on the faculty and as the president of the school, which is horrific. But we don't have to talk about that. But this article was about rabbinical students who signed this letter, essentially extremely critical of Israel and the ramifications of that. And some rabbis who were critical of the letter said, look, when rabbinical students sign a letter like this, that gives ammunition to anti-Semites who say we should boycott Israel and divest from companies operating in Israel. It actually hurts. And that ultimately hurts Palestinians and Arabs who are part of the Israeli economy. So people, even if they don't cross the line and say Israel's an apartheid state, when future rabbis say extremely negative things about Israel without much context to it, that gives fodder for others who truly do despise Israel and don't believe Israel should exist. And then the other sort of more mainstream rabbinical students said there's the signers of this letter didn't display any ahavat Yisrael, which means love of Israel. And so again, we're not exactly talking about anti-Semitism, but what we are talking about is how anti-Semites can make arguments. When rabbinical students would say Israel is guilty of oppressing others, that then can be used by people who truly hate Israel to say, look at Jews who are genocidal and don't care about the lives of others. So again, I don't quite know what to do about it. You know, the people who wrote this letter, I certainly don't agree with them, but I also think they certainly have the right to do that. But their careers are going to get hurt. You know, that they actually took some risks. The aftermath to the article, several people said, well, I would never offer a job to anyone who signed that letter. That's part of the process. What do you think? Do you think that people who are critical of Israel, if they're Jewish, give greater ammunition to anti-Semites? Or do you think that, that's just part of living in a society? No? Oh, good. I want some disagreement. I want people to disagree with each other. That's what makes it fun.
There has to be a way for people to say that Israel is doing wrong while still promoting the fact that Israel needs to exist.
Yeah.
Now, if I understand you correctly, you said there wasn't any of that in the letter. The letter didn't also say.
The letter deeply lacked context. It did not talk at all about Hamas shooting rockets into Israel. It simply focused on the Israeli army is targeting Palestinian civilians and has killed X. It didn't give the larger context. That was what a lot of people were critical of. And they said, well, we're not talking about the larger context. We're talking about Israel. We're holding Israel to account. But yes, it didn't put the contemporary issues in the broader context.
Because I'm sure those rabbis agree that Israel needs to exist.
Yes, I don't doubt that. And maybe a couple of the more extreme ones would say that they're non-Zionists, that they're not, if Israel were a binational state, they wouldn't oppose it. But I would say most of them would say, yes, Israel should exist as a Jewish state. Yeah. But it didn't, I guess part of what I'm trying to get at is these are nuanced issues, and most people don't do well with nuance. That especially in the area of anti-Semitism, that on both sides, there are people who say every person who is critical of Israel, that's anti-Semitic. There are people who do that. It's an unnuanced point of view. Then there are people who say every time Israel does something that's aggressive, Israel's evil and wrong. So you see it on both sides. You see this kind of lack of nuance. And I think that contributes to this polarizing environment. And we've come into this kind of an us versus them mentality on both sides of anti-Semitism. It's much harder to address anti-Semitism when it becomes political. when it becomes so divisive, you know, that, and that's where, as we move further away from nuance, we start to get more, it becomes harder to address anti-Semitism. So someone like Stephen Miller, you know, again, I'm not a huge fan of his by any means. I doubt anyone here is a fan of his, but I think it would be wrong to kind of call him an anti-Semite, in my opinion. You know, I think that makes it too much of a, it almost like inserts too much politics into addressing anti-Semitism. Fighting anti-Semitism should be something that includes conservative Jews and liberal Jews. All Jews should be against anti-Semitism. So it's, when it becomes too politicized, it's hard to address it. Does that make sense? Kind of what I'm trying to get at. And I think that is sort of where we're at right now. We've become this sort of, we become so extremely polarized that it makes these issues even harder to address. Other comments? Yeah, Mom?
Wasn't there a long period of time where Reformed Jews didn't want to have anything to do with Israel? I mean, that was a very, very difficult, I remember signs in front of certain synagogues that said, "We love Israel." And then there were, I don't remember if there were really signs in front of other places that said, "We don't, you know, that we don't stand for Zionism." But there was a lot of divisiveness in the Jewish community in regards to Israel.
Very much so. Very much so. This is mainly pre-World War II. You know, the Holocaust kind of, I mean, it's still sort of anti-Zionist Reform Judaism did exist after the Holocaust, but it was much less. But before World War II, there was a very, most Reform Jews were not supportive of the state of Israel, mainly because it was the idea that it would raise questions of dual loyalties, that our loyalty is to the United States and to support. Sure, we might be happy with Israel as a spiritual homeland for Jews, but not a political state. The person who really stopped, you know, there were the people who started to counter that narrative really started with Louis Brandeis, because Louis Brandeis was this very successful American who was also a very prominent Zionist. And he said, actually, you can be both. You can be a Jewish Zionist and a very proud American. And he started to break that mold. But that mold really persisted strongly up until World War II, and then it kind of faded out. I mean, it existed here and there. But in some ways, a little bit of that is coming back. A little bit of that is coming back, where you have people that are almost Jews who are embarrassed by Israel, and somewhat embarrassed by Jewish strength. You know, there's this idea that Jews should always be victims. And when a state like Israel, you know, when it's involved in war, there are some people who say, well, that's not my kind of Judaism. So this, again, I'm certainly not saying every critic is like that, but there is a kind of, there are people who are somewhat, embarrassed is probably not the right word, but who may be ashamed or concerned with, you know, part of the reason, you know, even early Israelis, they wanted to redefine Judaism. They believed that the Judaism of the ghetto was weak and that this new Zionism would be a Judaism of the land. In some ways, that was somewhat anti-Semitic too, because it was stereotyping a kind of ghetto Judaism. Okay, Marilyn.
Yes, last week they had Representative Bob Morgan, and
yeah, he's great.
Yeah, and he's a great speaker. And Hadassah had him speak about University of Illinois and campus and about anti-Semitism. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting, he said that he agrees with the definition that Hadassah has come up with for anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can't really talk about anti-Semitism unless you have a definition, unless you define it as you did in your book so beautifully. And the Hadassah has their own definition, and he said, well, I agree with that definition, but I can't say that the other congressmen will subscribe to it because of their own beliefs. So they can't even come up with a definition that they can agree upon. So that's a problem to begin with. So I thought it was fascinating.
That is.
And I thought to themselves, so
very fascinating.
So I said to them, I wanted to raise the book up and say, well, you have to buy Rabbi Moffic's book.
Yes.
So
yes.
I did call the person who narrated this morning, and I told her that Rabbi Moffic has a book. So I did at least say a couple.
I did try. You know who I tried to get to blurb it? I mean, at first I tried to get him to write an introduction, then I failed at that. I tried to get Senator Cory Booker to do it, because I have a friend who has a lot of contacts in Cory Booker's office, and I did not succeed in doing that. Unfortunately, I tried, but he would have been great to. But I think one of the reasons it's hard to get to a definition of anti-Semitism is, again, it has to do with Israel. That some of the definitions say that criticism of Israel, or at least could be read to suggest that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and that boycott, divestment, sanctions activities are anti-Semitic. And look, it's hard to make that argument. If a definition enshrines criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, then essentially you're regulating free speech in a way. You're overstepping boundaries. So definitions can be very political.
Yeah, for sure.
It is. It's complicated. Perhaps anti-Semitism is one of those ideas or phenomenon that in some cases you know it when you see it. It's sort of hard to pin down an exact definition, but there are instances that we could probably tell the difference between a legitimate criticism of Israel and a criticism of Israel that is motivated by anti-Semitism. And that is not always, but in some ways it depends on who's speaking. And that doesn't lend itself always to easy objective definitions. And this has been true throughout Jewish history. It's always been difficult to discern what is actually anti-Semitism and what isn't. A lot of times it's easy, saying Jews kill Christian children to use their blood to make matzah, that's clearly anti-Semitic. But somebody who says, well, Israel is guilty of oppressing Palestinians, well, one could easily make that argument, and make it in a legitimate way. So I think it's important to understand the context of anti-Semitism. And going back to that letter, that's part of what was wrong with the letter, in my opinion, was that it lacked some of that context. Yeah. I would encourage everyone to go back and read that New York Times article if you haven't already. It is absolutely, it's long, but it's absolutely fascinating. And it really kind of shows some of the issues that are confronting American Jews today. So thank you everyone so much. It's always good to talk and see you, and see you next week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.